Objects and arrays. They're super powerful in JavaScript and we use them all the time. We use them to represent real-life data structures. So when you're building an app and you have to represent something, some data that's a little bit more structured, where there's maybe even some nesting, then we use objects and arrays usually together. And that's the great power of objects and arrays. In JavaScript, you don't tend to use them just alone. You don't use arrays, simple arrays just alone, and you usually don't use objects in a simple way alone either. The power here is combining both together. And when you combine objects and arrays together, that's how you're able to represent real complex data structures. But it's actually pretty straightforward, and we're going to take a look at that. So I want to jump in, and that's the topic today: combining objects with arrays. And really, I want to highlight the fact. That arrays plus data objects, it really equals data structures. Any kind of data structure, you can represent it in JavaScript with arrays and data objects. And I just want to clarify here, what do I mean by data objects? I just mean plain objects. So there are different kinds of objects in JavaScript. There are the fancy ones, the complicated ones. Maybe we use objects to represent DOM elements in the page. We use them to represent all kinds of complex operations. But I'm just talking about plain data objects that you create in your code, and all you're using them for is to just store some data. That's what I mean by plain data objects. And those are the kinds of objects that, combined with arrays, they can be combined in different ways together, and we're going to look at that right away. But I also want to stress the fact that we can basically represent any complex data structure. So this opens the door for you to represent anything you need in JavaScript. And really, I'm talking about a couple of simple mechanisms that I'm going to show you, but that are used in real-world applications, no matter how complicated. Like, look at some of the biggest, most complex JavaScript applications you might know. Maybe the data structures that they use are really complicated and really have a lot of stuff in them, but they're still just probably represented with plain arrays and data objects. That's it. So once you have that power, there's no stopping you from going as complex as you need to be. So let's go beyond simple arrays and simple objects. The thing is, when I talk about simple arrays and simple objects, I'm talking about, for example, an array of strings or an array of numbers. Well, you reach a limitation pretty fast. If all you're doing is just storing a list of strings in an array, that's great, but how do you go more complex than that? How do you represent something more complicated? Well, here's really what we're building upon. Here are the building blocks. Number one, arrays can contain objects. So this is where we leave the world of simple arrays and we enter the world of arrays, where we actually have, as members of the array, we have objects. Already that gives us a huge amount of power. But it doesn't end there. I want to stress the second point. Object properties can contain arrays too. That's number two. And this is interesting because it means that inside of an object, one or more of the properties, instead of being a string or a number, those property values can be arrays. And those arrays can be whatever you want them to be. So that gives us point number three. They can be nested, and they can be nested infinitely. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that you can combine points number 1 and 2 here. Let's see. Arrays can contain objects. What if we combine that with the fact that object properties can contain arrays? Now, maybe you see where I'm going with this. Arrays, as we already explained here, they can contain objects. So you can have a nesting. That's what I mean by nesting. I mean an array that can contain an object, and that object can contain an array, and so forth. We can have infinite nesting like this that just keeps going. Now, in the real world, we're not going to nest anything infinitely. I mean, that's not a real thing. But in theory, we could, and maybe there are some limitations. Obviously, if you make some data structure that's too big, you're going to run out of memory. But theoretically, this nesting doesn't have an actual limit to it. Okay. So what does this mean in practice? Let's let's take a look. So let's start with actually a simple array of strings. Here I have an array I'm calling employees, and inside of this array, well, it's straightforward. I just have 3 strings. A simple array, right? That's as simple as you can go when it comes to arrays. So how do we make this more useful? Because I mean, listen, like if in a real world application, I just have a list of employees where all I have is just a list of names, that doesn't really get me very far, right? I mean, I just have a list of strings. What if I want to represent some more information about each of these employees beyond just their name, right? That's probably what I would like to do. So that's where a more complex array comes in, and specifically I'm talking about an array of objects, an array of plain objects. So this is a scenario where I'm actually going to say I'm going to decide to write some code where my employees are going to have 3 properties. They're going to have a name, they're going to have a city that they're from, and they're going to have a role. Okay, and all of those properties will be strings. Well, that's what I see here. So basically my employees now, well, it's still an array, right? Because I still have this inside of square brackets. It's just like the simple array. But instead of strings, now I have 3 values that are objects. How do I know that they're objects? Well, it's because simply enough, they start with curly brackets and they end with curly brackets. And I have these pairs of property names and values. So I basically decided that I'm going to have a name property, excuse me, I'm going to have a city property, and I'm going to have a role property on each of these 3 objects. There we go. So now, just by adding that, and you can see how the syntax is just like an array of 3 items, but instead of strings, they're now objects. Now, what about going the other way around? What if I started with a data object, and now I want to involve arrays into it, inside it, in some way? Well, here's the example. So let's say I have a user object here. I have a user. This is a typical scenario where maybe you're representing the user who is using the application, or maybe you have all kinds of users in your app, so you need to represent them as objects. And let's say I'm just starting out, so I don't have much yet to say about this user, but I do know that the user has a username. And I also know that the user has a skill. I might want to keep track of the skills of each user. Maybe it's so that they can show other users what skills they already know or what skills they're learning. I don't know. We'll figure that out if we're actually building this into a real app. But in this case, it's not enough. I have this user with 1 skill, but that's not enough because maybe I have multiple skills. Maybe it's useless to just say 1 skill if the whole goal of my little app here is for users to list their skills. That's where we come to the idea of a data object with an array inside. But before actually looking at this, I mean, we've just inserted in this example an array of strings. But let's back up for a bit, because let's say we do this and just ask the question, how do I represent multiple skills? In this scenario, I want to modify this object and make it capable of representing multiple skills, right? How do I do that? Okay, solution number 1. Here's an idea, all right? Here's an idea. I'm going to add more string properties. So now I started out with just string, but then I added another one, and I called it skill 2. And then I added a third one called skill 3. And I gave them values. Okay, so is this a valid solution? Well, it's not bad. It could work. But whenever you see this pattern where you see, well, hold on, I'm actually defining new properties for something that is actually a list. And it's a little bit clunky to call your properties, skill 2, skill 3. What if you have more skills that you want to add? What if some users have more skills and others have fewer skills? What do you do with those extra properties? That's why this is not the best solution. This is not a great solution, and it's actually something to watch out for. Anytime you see this pattern, where the pattern is that you're naming things with a 2 or a 3 or whatever after the name of your property or your variable, it's kind of a red flag. It means, hey, maybe pay attention to how you can make this into an array, because it's actually a list of things that you're dealing with. Solution 2. Okay, so this is a different solution. Use an array inside the object. Okay, I like this a lot better. Already we see no skill 2, skill 3. We don't need extra property names. That's great because that keeps things simpler. And we have a real array. So because, as you see here, we see the familiar square brackets. This is just a simple array that we've placed here in the value of the property. And I've named the skills with an S at the end because, hey, I want to represent the fact that this is now a list of skills. That's fantastic. So this is a better solution for that reason, because it's more flexible and we can very easily represent any number of skills here. And so for this example, it's actually a simple array because it's just a couple of strings. But what if it gets more involved? What if I have a recipe app? What if I want to keep track of recipes? I think recipes are actually a great example of data structures because you can get pretty deep into complex structures. They don't have to be complicated necessarily. Like when you're reading a recipe, it doesn't have to necessarily sound very complicated. But when you start digging into how to represent a recipe in data, you realize pretty soon that you're going to have to add some extra stuff here. You're going to have to add some complexity to really represent it properly. But let's start with a very basic example. Let's say I have this potato salad recipe, or any recipe, in my very simple recipe app that I'm just inventing on the spot here. What do I need to know? Well, at least I need to know the name. I need to know the name of my recipe. So I'm going to put a string property called name. But I also need to know some ingredients. That's at least a minimum, I think. So I decided to put an array of strings to represent my ingredients. Okay, hey, so this is actually a pretty good start. This is a good start where, my recipe isn't complete. I don't even have any steps for how to make this, but let's set that aside just for now. What happens if I want to keep track of multiple recipes? I mean, if I have a recipe app, chances are I actually want to keep track of multiple recipes. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to create a variable here, an array that I'm going to call recipes. And now I'm going to use the trick that we've already looked at, the trick of putting objects inside of my array, because it makes sense. I've created one recipe, which is an object, and now I'm going to just make more of those, and they're going to be in this array. So it's like you can look at this from the outside, and you can always look at the brackets, the opening and closing brackets. Whenever we have this, we know that the thing we're looking at here is an array. This whole big thing is an array. And regardless of what's inside, we can always identify an array because of these square brackets. But now what do we have inside? Well, I identify here curly brackets, and that tells me this is an object. And same thing in this second item. This is a second object. Now let's dig into the objects. Okay, so I have a name and I have ingredients. Well, this, as I already mentioned this, well, it's square brackets, so this is an array. Same thing with this second recipe here. It's another array. So now we've identified already a structure that's getting a little bit more complicated. Okay, this is very interesting. We have an array. Inside of that array, we have objects. And inside of each of these objects, we have a further array. Okay, so great. We can still keep track of all this. This is the thing. It's very possible to keep track of even very complex data structures. Just take it one step at a time. Look at it from the outside in. I always like to do this, when I look right here. Whenever there is a variable being defined, and I see a big block of code like this, a big block of objects and arrays all mixed together. First thing I like to do is I like to look right here. Where does it begin? What is the outer object? Are we even talking about just one big array with a bunch of stuff in it? Or are we talking about one big object with a bunch of stuff in it? And how do you find out? Well, you just look right there where it's defined at the very beginning, and whether it's a square bracket or a curly bracket, right away that gives you the insight about what it is. But our recipe object here, it's limited. I mean, I'm listing ingredients, but what does that give me? A potato salad, with just potatoes as one ingredient and mayo as another ingredient, what about quantities? How do I know how much do I need to put in? That's kind of the minimum, right? You end up realizing that's probably the minimum information you need to know about the recipe, the ingredients, is the quantities. So now I'm upgrading my recipe object. I'm going to add more. And what I'm changing is that inside of ingredients that I have here, I am now putting objects inside. So each ingredient, it's not enough to just have a string. For each ingredient, I'm going to need an object. And that means I have two. In this example, I have two objects in the ingredients array. And well, what do I need to know? Let's say I'm going to put a name and a quantity for each one. That's kind of the basic, I think. Right? Maybe you would you need any more? I don't think so. Actually, name of the ingredient and the quantity of the ingredient are the two fields you need for each ingredient. Okay, great. So now I actually have a recipe, well, something that is starting to resemble an actual recipe. That's cool. So I just am showing on this, in this example, just this potato salad recipe. But what if we put it all together? All right, now we have a nice big data structure. And I want to show you this just to see, well, we can actually build this up. This is, like I've showed you how I've built this object piece by piece by putting objects into arrays and arrays into objects. And you can keep going and make this more and more complex, but it's still something that you can read and you can reason through no matter how complex it becomes. So once again, and I like to start here just to get a point of reference, just to make sure we're still on the same page. What's the overall object here? Well, I look at the start, and you can look at the closing bracket too, but it should match. So this recipes object is an array. Okay, cool. Now the name, actually, I like to put plural names, right? I like to name my variable recipes. It's a plural, so already it gives me a hint, and it gives other people who will read my code, it gives them a hint that says, hey, maybe this is an array, right? It's a plural thing. And what it is an array of, it's an array of recipes. That's good information just from the name of the variable. And that, just as a side note, this is why it's important to name your variables as clearly as possible, right? Now, what is inside of these recipes? Well, right away I see that actually I have two objects inside of my recipe array. Okay, great. So I have one big object here. This is the object that has a name potato salad, and I have another one here, and it has the name cheese sandwich. So name is one property. What is another property? Ingredients. And I see that there's the same thing on the other one. So we have an array called ingredients. What's inside of this array? Well, it looks like inside of this array we have further objects. I'll just highlight them here, right? And these objects have a name and a quantity. Does it look like the same thing below? Yeah, it's actually the exact same pattern. Now, I decided to give these ingredients a name and a quantity. But that's a decision that I made as a coder. I decided that's what I need in this data. But another decision I made is that I'm going to stick to this pattern for every single ingredient. So I'm just deciding that every ingredient is going to have a name and a quantity. And so that's why all of them have that. But there's no rule that's saying that has to be the case. The code itself isn't restricting me to have each of the ingredients be the same. They could have extra properties, or they could have fewer properties. Maybe some ingredients could be missing a quantity field entirely. That's up to me to decide, and it's also up to me to decide if I do that, if I have extra properties or fewer properties, I have to decide what is my code going to do when there is no quantity. Well, I'll have to decide what to put instead, or, I don't know. That's just a side note. A side note that this is the convention that I'm choosing to use here. Okay, great. So yeah, so we see that we have two ingredient objects, but I'm just gonna, and I'll use a different color here, I'm just gonna draw what this is part of. So because we have these square brackets, this is an array. And the same thing here. That's an array of ingredients. Cool. And because I already determined here that each actual, actually let's make this my red color. Each of these, look at that, these that I already marked, these objects, well, these are my recipe objects, and that makes 2 of them right here. Okay, great. Now, what is the overall object? Like, well, it's not an object, actually. I was determined it's actually an array. And that's an array that encompasses this whole expression. That's an array. Now, okay, maybe my drawing ends up looking a little bit messy, but what I'm trying to illustrate is that it's actually not messy in terms of structure. You can deconstruct a crazy complicated, look at this, a crazy complicated data structure like this. And this is the typical kind of thing. You would see this. I'm saying you would see this in a real world JavaScript application. Something as complex as this, maybe even a little bit more complex, very typical. This is exactly how we use objects and arrays in real world applications. And you can map it out just piece by piece and figure out what the parts of it are. And that's pretty much it. That's how it works. So I'm going to leave you on that. My name is Marek. You want more content from me, go to my website, javascriptwithmarek.com, and subscribe there. And I'm going to see you in the next video.